They dragged her by the hair through the dirt-packed street, her arms bound behind her and a torn loaf of bread crushed in the mud beside her. Folks didn't look away. They watched. Some spat, others laughed. In a town like Redding Bluff, mercy was a luxury reserved for men with land and women with names that carried weight. Sarah had neither. Just bone-thin limbs, a torn shawl, and eyes that refused to lower, even as her knees scraped raw against gravel. She hadn't stolen out of rebellion. She'd stolen because her baby brother hadn't eaten in 2 days. But when she reached for the loaf cooling behind the bakery, the shopkeeper saw. And in this town, theft was treated like witchcraft. Public, painful, and humiliating. The sheriff, a man with tobacco-stained teeth and too much time on his hands, strutted beside her like he was escorting a prize. "Steal from this town," he said loudly, "and you pay in blood or shame." Someone hurled a clod of horse dung. It struck her shoulder, and she winced but kept her head up. Because she had no one. Because she had to believe this wouldn't be the end. At the edge of the crowd, leaning against a post carved with Lakota symbols, stood a man the town called Ghost Wolf. Most folks whispered that he was dangerous, not because he carried a weapon, but because he never flinched. He rarely spoke, never begged, and once stared down a preacher who tried to call him savage. He watched the girl tumble forward onto her knees, her lips split, her palms bleeding into the dirt. For a moment, nothing happened. The sun kept climbing. The townspeople kept jeering. And then Ghost Wolf stepped forward. "That's enough," he said, not loud but deep, and in a voice that made even the sheriff pause. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "This your girl?" "She is now." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ghost Wolf didn't wait for permission. He moved with quiet power, untying her wrists, lifting her as if she weighed no more than air. She sagged against him, too stunned to speak. "You'll answer for this," the sheriff growled. Ghost Wolf didn't look back. "So will you." And just like that, they vanished into the morning mist beyond the livery stables. One girl broken, one man silent, and a whole town suddenly unsure if they had just watched a rescue or the beginning of a reckoning. The horse moved slow, careful with its burden, as Ghost Wolf guided it up the wooded path out of town. Sarah slumped in the saddle, one side of her face bruised, her lip crusted in dried blood, arms trembling around the coarse blanket he'd wrapped around her shoulders. She hadn't said a word since they left the gawking crowd behind, and Ghost Wolf didn't ask for one. He knew silence could be shelter, especially after a storm that tried to shatter a person. The trail led them higher, where the pines grew thicker and the wind carried the scent of cedar smoke. His cabin stood where no sheriff dared ride, on Lakota land, though no lines were drawn on any map. The world didn't mark places the way Ghost Wolf did. He saw sacred ground where others saw wilderness, healing in trees where others saw shadows. When they arrived, he lifted Sarah down gently, like she was something fragile but not broken, and carried her inside. The cabin was small, one room with a stone hearth already glowing from the fire he'd banked earlier, a thick bearskin draped across a low bed, shelves lined with herbs, tools, and small carvings of animals. Sarah sat stiffly on a stool near the fire. Her eyes darted to every corner like a trapped thing. Ghost Wolf moved slow, speaking only when necessary. "You hungry?" he asked, pulling down a kettle. She nodded once, eyes lowering. As he poured water into the pot, her voice rasped out, "They'll come for me." He didn't turn. "Let them try." "They hate you." He glanced over his shoulder. "And?" She didn't respond, but something in her posture loosened. The steam rose, and soon the cabin filled with the smell of broth and herbs. When he handed her the bowl, she drank greedily at first, then slower, tasting warmth for the first time in days. She coughed and set it down. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you help me?" Ghostwolf sat across from her, hands folded over his knee. His voice was calm, low. "Because they looked at you like you were nothing, and I've seen what happens when no one stops them." Her eyes met his. There was no pity in his face, just quiet resolve and something old in his gaze, something that had seen too much and kept going anyway. She leaned back, let the fire soak into her bones. For the first time in years, Sarah felt the smallest flicker of safety. And though the bruises still throbbed, she finally slept, guarded by the silence of a man who'd once been broken, too. Sarah awoke to birdsong and the smell of pine sap. Her eyes blinked open slowly, adjusting to the soft light pouring through the cabin window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory returned. Not all at once, but in pieces. The bread, the crowd, the rope, the man who stepped between her and the world. She sat up slowly, body aching but no longer trembling. A folded blanket covered her legs. Ghostwolf was outside, splitting wood with clean, precise strikes. She watched him through the open door, his movements steady, unhurried, purposeful. There was something grounding in his presence, something that told her she was not a burden here. When he returned, he handed her a mug of warm tea, thick with crushed roots and something sweet she couldn't name. "You'll need strength," he said simply. She sipped, then asked, "Why do they call you Ghostwolf?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat on the stool across from her and stared into the fire. "Because I don't haunt graves," he said quietly. "I walk away from them." The words weren't meant to impress. They were simply true. Sarah looked at him differently then. Not like a savior, but like someone who had survived enough to recognize another drowning soul. Over the next few days, she rested. He taught her to boil pine needles for tea, to press comfrey against bruises, to listen for shifts in the wind before the animals even stirred. She spoke little, but when she did, it was with careful honesty. She told him about her brother, Caleb, left hidden in the root cellar behind the burned-out boarding house in town. "He's just a boy," she whispered. "I only stole because I had to feed him." Ghostwolf nodded. "Then we'll get him." She stared. "You'd do that?" "He's your blood," he replied, as if that was reason enough. One morning she found a small carving beside her bed. A wolf, tiny and smooth, its head tilted as if listening. She picked it up gently. "You made this?" He nodded. "Your strength doesn't lie in how you fell," he said. "It lies in how you stood back up." She clutched the carving to her chest and turned toward the door, where the morning sun spilled in golden. The town might still curse her name, but here, among the trees and silence, Sarah began to remember a version of herself untouched by shame. A version she might become again. Maybe for Caleb, maybe for herself, maybe for both. They left before dawn, moving swift and silent through the thinning mist. Ghostwolf rode ahead, Sarah behind him on a borrowed mare, her fingers clutching the reins with white-knuckled tension. She hadn't been to town since the day they'd dragged her through it. But the thought of Caleb hidden and hungry in that dark cellar lit something fierce inside her. They didn't speak as they rode, but Ghostwolf's steady presence was louder than words. Each decision purposeful, each movement wrapped in the quiet certainty of a man who'd rescued others before. When the outline of Redding Bluff crept over the hill, Sarah's breath caught. Her heart pounded with every step closer. But Ghostwolf didn't hesitate. He led them around the outskirts, cutting behind an abandoned barn where the long grass swallowed hoof prints. "Wait here," he said low. "If I don't return in 10 minutes, ride north." But she grabbed his sleeve. "I'm not leaving without him." He studied her face for a beat, then gave a small nod. "Then stay behind me." The charred ruins of the boarding house sagged under morning haze. Sarah's boots barely made a sound as she crept to the cellar door, half hidden beneath a sheet of rusted tin and straw. Her hands shook as she pulled it open. "Caleb?" she whispered. For a moment there was only darkness, then movement. A pair of wide, dirt-streaked eyes blinked up at her. "Sarah?" His voice cracked. She let out a breath that was half sob, half laugh, and reached down to pull him up. Caleb was thinner than she remembered, and his arms clung to her like roots desperate for soil. "I thought you were dead," he whispered. "I almost was," she said, pressing her cheek to his. "But someone helped me. We're going to be okay now." Behind her, Ghostwolf kept watch, his eyes scanning every shadow. When Sarah emerged with Caleb in her arms, he gave one small nod and turned to lead them away. But then, a sound. A shout in the distance. "Hey, there!" A man on horseback spotted them from across the square. More voices rose. Sarah froze, clutching Caleb tight. Ghostwolf turned. "Go," he said firmly. "I'll catch up." She hesitated, but his voice sharpened. "Now." She bolted toward the woods, Caleb clinging to her, while Ghostwolf stepped into the open street, drawing the attention of the men behind her like a hawk circling back into a storm. His presence was not panic, but purpose. And Sarah, breathless and running, knew this wasn't just an escape. It was the beginning of something neither the town nor the past could undo. The hooves thundered toward him, 5 men on horseback with rifles slung and fury sharpened by pride. Ghostwolf stood in the middle of the road, unarmed, his coat flaring in the morning wind, his shadow stretched long behind him like a legend forming in real time. The sheriff was among them, his lip curled. "You again," he spat, spurring his horse closer. "Ain't it enough you stole her once? Now you're harboring the boy, too?" Ghostwolf didn't flinch. "She stole nothing. She fed her brother. You humiliated her." The sheriff snorted. "You don't get to rewrite the rules of this town?" "Then maybe this town needs different rules." The standoff stretched, and for a breathless moment, the street fell still. Women peeked from windows, children pressed against porch rails. No one dared speak. No one dared blink. The sheriff raised his rifle. "Step aside, Lakota. That girl and boy are property of Redding Bluff now." "She is no one's property," Ghostwolf said, voice low as thunder before a storm. "And the boy is blood. I don't let families starve." He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have to. His calm was louder than any bullet. The men shifted in their saddles, unsure. There was something unnerving about a man who didn't fear death, something that made even killers pause. The sheriff took one step forward. "Last warning." Ghostwolf stepped forward, too. "Then fire," he said, eyes unblinking. "And watch your town fall apart before sundown." The weight of the words settled over the street like dust after a collapse. The sheriff didn't pull the trigger. His hand hovered, fingers twitching. But something in the silence made him lower the rifle. He spat near Ghostwolf's boots. "Take her then. Take the damn kid, but don't come back." Ghostwolf didn't respond. He just turned and walked away, each step as steady as the first. Behind him, the riders didn't move. Not one dared follow. By the time he reached the tree line, Sarah and Caleb had reappeared, waiting in the shadows like 2 rabbits unsure of the hunter's gun. "Did they—" she began. He shook his head once. "They won't come again." Caleb stared up at the man, wide-eyed. Are you going to be my new pa? Sarah flushed, but Ghost Wolf didn't smile or frown. He knelt beside the boy and placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm going to be the one who makes sure you grow up without chains on your name. Caleb nodded, like that was enough. Sarah looked at the trees beyond. It didn't feel like escape anymore. It felt like the start of a home. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and wild onion when they returned, and the wind outside whistled through the eaves like it had missed them. Caleb ran his small fingers along the carved wolf on the windowsill, eyes wide with wonder. Ghost Wolf had carved it himself, like he did many things, with patience, quiet, and meaning. Sarah folded blankets by the hearth, her bruises fading now, her limbs stronger. She still startled when the wind snapped a shutter, but she no longer flinched when someone reached near her. That was something. Caleb slept in a bed of pine boughs, and Sarah spent her nights curled close to him, her hand always resting lightly on his back, as if to remind herself he was still there, still breathing. Ghost Wolf hunted, fished, and kept his word without fuss. He didn't ask for thanks, and she didn't offer it. But the space between them grew warmer, not with words, but with presence. One night, as the fire crackled low and Caleb snored softly, Sarah looked at Ghost Wolf across the room. I don't understand why you did it, she said. Why take in someone like me? He didn't look up from the strip of leather he was threading. Because someone once did the same for me, he replied, and if they hadn't, I'd be bones in a ditch outside the Dakota line. She let the silence hang before speaking again. I don't know how to pay you back. Don't, he said. Live. That's the only thing they don't expect from people like us. Her throat tightened. I don't even know who I am anymore. He finally met her gaze. That's good. It means you get to decide. The fire popped, and Caleb rolled over, murmuring in his sleep. Outside, snow had begun to fall in thin, weightless sheets. Sarah rose and added another log to the fire, watching the embers flare. This warmth, she said softly. It feels like something I haven't had since I was a child. Ghost Wolf stood beside her then, close but not touching. It's yours now. She didn't respond, but her eyes shimmered in the firelight. She'd been dragged, beaten, and called less than nothing. But here, in this place carved from bark and bone and quiet kindness, she was becoming again. The fire that didn't go out had nothing to do with wood. It lived in people, and it burned quietly, bravely, beneath skin that had once only known cold. The snow had fallen thick overnight, cloaking the valley in silence so heavy it seemed to press on Sarah's lungs as she stepped outside to gather kindling, her breath hanging in the cold air while the cabin behind her whispered warmth through the cracks in its timber walls where Ghost Wolf sat sharpening his blade, and Caleb slept soundly. It should have felt like safety, but peace in the wilds was never more than borrowed time, and the stillness broke with a distant snap. Sharp, deliberate, too heavy for a tree limb. She turned toward the ridge instinctively, but Ghost Wolf was already at her side, his face carved with knowing, his voice low and certain as he told her to take Caleb and hide. And Sarah didn't hesitate. She pulled her brother into the root cellar trap door beneath the cabin, their breaths quick and shallow in the earth-scented dark, as she pressed him close beneath a wool blanket and tried not to let him feel her shaking. Above them came the slow crunch of boots and a sheriff's drawl laced with cruelty, calling out Ghost Wolf's name and demanding the return of stolen property. Her, the boy, their lives, and threatening the scalp he'd leave behind. Sarah's heartbeat filled her ears as she heard Ghost Wolf's reply, steady and unmoved, followed by a crack of gunfire that splintered the boards overhead. Caleb whimpered, and Sarah held her breath as the sounds above turned into chaos. More gunshots, a thud, a crash, and then sudden silence so loud it roared. When the trapdoor finally creaked open, she braced for the worst but saw only Ghost Wolf kneeling there, blood staining his sleeve, but his eyes calm as he told her it was over. As she climbed out, the morning light poured in, and she followed his gaze to where a trail of blood in the snow led away into the woods. No posse, no more shouting, only the aftermath of a battle fought and won without witnesses. She didn't know how to say thank you for something like that, didn't have the language to name what it meant when a man stood between her and the world, like a wall of stone. But as she wrapped Caleb's arms around her waist and looked at Ghost Wolf's torn shirt and quiet strength, she knew this wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about becoming something unbreakable together. Ghost Wolf's wound worsened through the night, soaking through the cloth Sarah had packed against it, and though he grit his teeth and tried to hide the pain, his skin grew pale, his breath shallow, and Sarah knew that without help he wouldn't last long. So at dawn, she bundled Caleb in furs, saddled the old mule, and rode hard towards the edge of the valley, where Ghost Wolf once mentioned an old trail the Lakota still watched from time to time. The forest pressed in thick and cold, shadows stretching like claws across the snow, but she kept going, whispering prayers she hadn't said since her mother died. And just when her hope began to fade, she spotted movement atop the ridge. An eagle-feathered rider on a painted horse, unmoving as a statue but unmistakably alive. She raised her hand high, a sign of peace, and the rider came down slowly, watching her with unreadable eyes until she choked out her plea. "Ghost Wolf is hurt. He needs you, please." Without a word, the man turned his horse and gestured for her to follow, and they rode back in silence through the still trees until the cabin came into view, and the man dismounted and entered like he'd known the place for years. Caleb clung to Sarah's side as they watched the visitor kneel beside Ghost Wolf, lift the bandage, and mutter something in Lakota before pulling herbs and sinew from a pouch at his side. He worked with speed and certainty, stitching flesh and binding bone like a man who'd done it 100 times. And when it was done, he stood and looked at Sarah with a face lined by both wisdom and war, then finally spoke, calling himself Red Clay, Ghost Wolf's blood brother from a time long before she had ever arrived. He said Ghost Wolf had once taken an arrow for him at Wounded Ford, and that today's healing was a debt finally paid. But more than that, he said, this man of few words had risked exile for a woman and child not his own, and such loyalty deserved to be matched. Then he looked at Sarah and said, "You must keep him warm now, not with fire, but with the reason to stay." He mounted his horse again and left as silently as he came, vanishing into the pine like a ghost. That night, as Sarah sat by the fire holding Ghost Wolf's hand, watching his chest rise with slow, even breaths, she realized something had changed, not just in him, but in her. She was no longer someone who needed saving. She was someone who would now fight to keep this warmth alive. By the time the last of the snow melted into the earth and the valley turned soft with spring, Ghost Wolf was walking without leaning on the cabin wall, his shoulders stiff but healed. And Sarah could see the change in him, not just in how he moved, but in how he looked at her and Caleb, no longer like a man guarding strays, but like someone home for the first time. They worked quietly, days filled with mending tools, stacking firewood, planting herbs, and teaching Caleb how to mark words into bark so he could one day remember where he came from. Ghost Wolf spoke of a place deeper in the valley, Hollow Glen, where the soil was good and the trees gave shade even in summer, and together they agreed to build there, not to hide, but to begin. They packed what little they had and traveled on foot through thick woods until they found the clearing he described. And it was as beautiful as he'd promised, ringed by willows and kissed by a creek that sang even in drought. There, they raised a second cabin, not as a shelter from the world, but as a place that would welcome it. Sarah stitched blankets from old flour sacks, Caleb chased birds barefoot until dusk, and Ghostwolf taught them to trap, to read the wind, to listen to what the land said when it spoke in rustling leaves and shifting animal tracks. Then one morning, the silence broke with hooves. Not angry men with guns, but a small group of Lakota riders, women and children and 2 elders, their faces curious, not cruel. One dismounted, a tall woman with silver streaks in her braids, and approached with calm grace, saying they had heard of a woman who raised a child not her own, a child of 2 worlds, and they had come to see for themselves. Sarah didn't speak, only knelt beside Caleb and held him close, her hand on his small shoulder. The woman looked at Ghostwolf, then back at Sarah and said, "The child must be named properly, not just for blood, but for what he's bridged." Ghostwolf turned to Sarah and nodded once, and with tears caught in her throat, she said softly, "Let them call him River Between." Because he carried both her and Ghostwolf across a place they never knew they could survive. The Lakota woman smiled and whispered the name to the others, and one by one, they repeated it until the name River Between wasn't just an idea, but something the wind and the trees seemed to carry too. The sun rose warm and golden over Hollow Glen, casting light across the cabin walls and the still glittering creek, and for the first time in years, Sarah woke not with dread or duty, but with quiet joy as she watched River Between, Caleb, renamed and reborn, run through the tall grass barefoot, his laughter rising like birdsong. Ghostwolf stood near the fire pit, turning a carved piece of wood in his hand, a small toy horse he'd shaped for the boy, and when he saw Sarah watching, he simply nodded, the way a man nods when he knows the storm has passed for good. Word had spread, not through newspapers or telegrams, but from lips to ears, from hearts that had once been hardened now softened by stories told around fires and over fences. And one day, they came, not the lawmen or townsfolk with torches, but women from Redding Bluff with thread and bread and cautious hope in their eyes. They didn't come to accuse, but to understand, standing in the clearing unsure of how to speak the apology buried under years of judgment, until one elder stepped forward and offered Sarah a loaf wrapped in cloth and said softly, "We heard what he did for you, and how you stayed." Sarah accepted it without a word, her hands trembling not from fear but from the weight of being seen, truly seen. That night, as fire crackled, and the Lakota guests who'd stayed behind shared stories in their native tongue, River Between sat in Ghostwolf's lap, tracing the ridges of his scarred knuckles with his small fingers, and asking what stars meant, and Ghostwolf, usually silent, answered with a tale about a warrior who gave up his war for a boy he didn't know was his. Sarah stitched the final corner of the quilt that wrapped them all now. 3 names embroidered side by side. Hers, River's, and Ghostwolf's name in Lakota, Wichapi, meaning star. The name wasn't just for the sky, but for the light that found them even when the road had been darkest. And as the fire dimmed and the valley breathed in peace, Sarah realized the cruel laughter of townspeople, the dragging, the hunger, the cold, all of it had led here. Not to rescue, but to something better. A family built not by blood or law, but by choice, by courage, and by the love that no one could ever take from them again.